10-year-old girl gave the dog a bath in the kitchen sink when the millionaire saw... Richard Anderson Miller was overcome with tears of rage and despair as he watched his 10-year-old granddaughter Emily carefully lathering up a golden retriever in the Carrara marble sink of his kitchen. Water spilled over the pristine countertop that had cost a fortune, but it was the girl's radiant smile that made him hesitate before exploding. Then his voice boomed through the kitchen like thunder. Emily had broken the most important rule of the house. "Emily, what are you doing?" Richard shouted, veins bulging in his neck. The startled girl turned around, still clutching the wet dog to her chest. Her little hands trembled, but she didn't let go. "Grandpa, I can explain," she murmured, her voice shaky. "Explain? You brought this mutt into my house, into my kitchen." Richard stepped forward, his face red with indignation. The 62-year-old businessman had built an empire of malls across the state of New York. His mansion in the Upper East Side reflected every penny earned through sweat and determination over 4 decades of hard work. Every piece of furniture, every detail had been handpicked, and now his granddaughter was destroying it all. "Grandpa, please let me finish bathing him," Emily begged, hugging the dog tighter. "You will remove that filthy animal from my house right now," Richard roared. "Where's Margaret? How did she allow this?" Margaret was the housekeeper who had managed the home for 15 years. A trusted woman who had never failed before. Richard couldn't understand how this was happening. "Margaret had to leave, Grandpa. Her mother got sick," Emily explained, tears starting to roll down her face. "And you took the chance to bring this flea-ridden thing into my home." Richard pointed at the dog as if it was something repulsive. The animal was a golden mutt, medium-sized with long fur and very expressive brown eyes. He was hurt, with cuts on his paws and scratches on his snout. Even wet and trembling, the dog remained calm in the girl's arms. "He was hurt, Grandpa. Someone hurt him really bad," Emily sobbed. "I couldn't leave him suffering on the street." Richard felt a pang in his chest, but smothered any trace of compassion. Since Emily had come to live with him after the accident that took her parents, he had set strict rules. Order was essential to maintaining control over his life and emotions. "I don't care what happened to him. My house has rules, Emily. You know that," he said, his voice more controlled but still shaking with anger. "But Grandpa..." "No buts. You will take that animal out of here immediately. And then you'll clean up this entire mess," Richard interrupted, pointing at the puddles of water on the marble floor. Emily hugged the dog so tightly, he let out a soft whimper. She looked her grandfather in the eyes with a determination that surprised him. "If Duke leaves, I'm going with him," the girl declared with a firmness that didn't match her 10 years. "Duke?" Richard arched his eyebrows. "You've already named this thing." "He's not a thing, Grandpa. He's Duke, and he needs me." Emily lifted her chin, defying her grandfather. The girl's courage infuriated Richard even more. How dare a 10-year-old challenge him in his own home? He had given her shelter, food, top-tier education, private tutors, everything money could buy. And this was the gratitude he received. "You're not going anywhere because you have nowhere to go," Richard said coldly. "Your parents are gone, Emily. I'm all you have." The words came out harsher than he intended. Emily flinched as if she'd been slapped. Duke growled softly, as if sensing the girl's pain. "I know they're gone," Emily whispered, tears now streaming freely down her face. "But that doesn't mean I can't love anyone else. Dear listener, if you're enjoying the story, don't forget to like and especially subscribe to the channel. It really helps those of us just starting out. Now, continuing." Richard felt a lump in his throat. His granddaughter's words echoed painfully in his mind. He too had lost someone in that accident. His only son, Daniel, and daughter-in-law, Catherine, the couple who had brought joy to this now silent, cold house. "Love only brings suffering, Emily," Richard murmured, more to himself than to her. "It's better not to get attached to anything or anyone." "Daddy didn't think that way," Emily countered bravely. "He always told me love is the only thing worth having in life." The mention of his son made Richard clench his fists. Daniel had been everything to him, the perfect heir, a business graduate from the country's top university, married to a brilliant lawyer. They had their whole lives ahead of them, when that out-of-control truck changed everything. Your father was wrong, Richard said bitterly. Love didn't protect him from anything. Emily hugged Duke even tighter, as if the dog were her only shield against her grandfather's coldness. Daddy taught me that when we love someone, we take care of them, she said, her voice steady despite the tears. Duke needs care. That's why I brought him here. Richard watched the scene before him, his granddaughter in a soaked yellow dress, her brown hair stuck to her tear-streaked face, holding a mutt as if it were her greatest treasure. For a moment, he saw Daniel there, the same determination, the same innocent kindness his son had always carried. Where did you find this dog? Richard asked, trying to keep his voice steady. I found him on the street near school. Some boys were throwing rocks at him, Emily explained, wiping her nose on her sleeve. They laughed when I told them to stop, said I was silly for caring about an ugly mutt. A different kind of anger rose in Richard's chest, not directed at the dog or his granddaughter, but at those boys who had hurt a defenseless animal. What did you do? He asked, almost without meaning to. I waited for them to leave and brought Duke with me. He was bleeding so much, Grandpa, I couldn't leave him there. Emily stroked the dog's head, and he nuzzled her neck. Richard fell silent for several minutes, watching the interaction between his granddaughter and the animal. The dog seemed to understand Emily had saved him. His brown eyes held a gratitude that touched something deep in the businessman's heart. How long has he been here? Richard asked, his voice softer now. 3 days, Emily admitted, shrugging. I hid him in Margaret's old room, the one she doesn't use anymore. I only brought him out because he was really dirty, and I wanted to take proper care of his wounds. 3 days. Richard was surprised. How did I not notice? You come home very late from work, Grandpa, and leave very early in the morning, Emily said without accusation, simply stating a fact. Her words stabbed at Richard's heart. It was true. Ever since Emily had come to live with him, he'd buried himself even deeper in work. Spreadsheets and meetings were easier to handle than the brown eyes that reminded him so much of the son he'd lost. And how did you feed him? Richard crossed his arms. With my food, Emily replied timidly. And with my lunch money from school, I bought dog food and medicine for his cuts. Richard stepped closer, examining the dog more carefully. There were indeed cuts on his paws that seemed to have been tended to. The animal wasn't as thin as he'd expected, a sign Emily had taken good care of him. Did you spend your lunch money to take care of him? I wasn't very hungry anyway, Emily lied, avoiding her grandfather's gaze. Richard knew his granddaughter well enough to recognize the lie. Emily had always had a healthy appetite. The thought of her skipping a meal to feed a stray tugged at something inside him. Emily, look at me, Richard said firmly. The girl raised her brown eyes, so much like her father's. Do you realize what could happen if this dog is sick? If he has some contagious disease? Emily shook her head. He's not sick, Grandpa, just hurt. I took good care of him, I promise. What if he bites someone? What if he breaks something in the house? What if he makes a mess? Richard fired off questions one after another. He won't do any of that. Emily defended Duke like a lioness protecting her cub. He's a good boy. Just look. Emily set Duke down on the wet kitchen floor. The dog stayed by her side, watching Richard without any aggression, just curiosity and a little fear. Sit, Duke, Emily commanded. To Richard's surprise, the dog obeyed immediately, wagging his wet tail. Shake, she said. Duke lifted his right paw and placed it in Emily's outstretched hand. Richard couldn't hide his astonishment. The animal was clearly intelligent and well-trained. This didn't seem like an ordinary stray. Where did he learn that? Richard murmured more to himself. I taught him these past few days, Emily said proudly. He learns super fast. He's really smart. Richard crouched down to the dog's level. Duke studied him carefully, neither retreating nor advancing, just waiting. He doesn't seem afraid of me, Richard observed, slowly extending his hand. Duke sniffed it, and after a few seconds, pressed his wet nose against Richard's skin. The warmth of the dog's muzzle surprised him. He knows you're a good person, Grandpa, Emily whispered. Animals can sense that. Richard pulled his hand back as if burned. He couldn't afford to feel anything for this animal. He'd already suffered too much loss. This changes nothing, Emily. He can't stay here. Richard stood, his tone hardening again. Why not? Emily's voice cracked with desperation. Because this is my house, and I make the rules. And my rule is, no pets. But why? Emily persisted. What's so bad about having a dog? Richard felt his patience thinning. How could he explain to a 10-year-old that he couldn't risk loving anything again? That he'd lost too much already and couldn't bear another loss? Because animals die, Emily, he said bluntly. They get sick, they grow old, and they die. And I won't go through that again. Everybody dies someday, Grandpa. Emily countered with wisdom that startled Richard. But that doesn't mean we can't love them while they're here. Her words hung in the kitchen's silence. Richard found himself speechless, confronted by the simple, pure logic of a child. Besides, Emily continued, if we don't love Duke, he might die alone on the street. At least here he'd die loved. Richard's legs nearly gave way. She'd just voiced his deepest fears, but with a perspective he'd never considered. Emily, he began, but the sound of the front door opening cut him off. Mr. Richard, Emily? Margaret's voice carried down the hallway. The housekeeper had arrived at the most tense moment of their discussion. Richard and Emily exchanged glances, both knowing they'd now have to explain the situation to Margaret. We're in the kitchen, Margaret, Richard called, never taking his eyes off his granddaughter. Margaret appeared at the kitchen door and stopped abruptly at the scene. Emily drenched, a dog in the middle of the kitchen, water everywhere, and Richard with an expression she couldn't decipher. Good heavens, what happened here? Margaret exclaimed, clutching her chest. Emily brought this animal into the house, Richard explained, gesturing toward Duke. Margaret looked at Emily with a mix of surprise and understanding. The 58-year-old housekeeper had taken care of Daniel when he was a child. She knew the family better than anyone. Oh, my dear, Margaret sighed. You brought a little dog? Margaret, don't start feeling sorry for her, Richard warned. You know very well pets aren't allowed in this house. I know, Mr. Richard, Margaret replied diplomatically, but let me understand the situation first. The housekeeper approached Emily and knelt beside her. Tell Margaret where you found this dog, sweetheart. Emily repeated the whole story to the housekeeper, who listened attentively. Richard watched the scene, noticing how Margaret showed genuine interest and affection for her granddaughter. And you took care of him all by yourself these 3 days? Margaret asked, impressed. Emily nodded sheepishly. I used the room you don't sleep in anymore, and I gave him food from my lunchbox. Oh my, Margaret murmured, touched by the girl's dedication. And how did you know how to treat his injuries? I remembered when Mom took care of me when I hurt my knee. She cleaned it with peroxide and put on ointment, Emily explained. Richard felt a pang as he remembered Catherine tending to their daughter's wounds. His daughter-in-law had always been so attentive and loving toward Emily. Mr. Richard, Margaret stood and addressed her employer. May I speak with you privately? Richard hesitated. He knew Margaret well enough to suspect she'd try to convince him to let the dog stay. The housekeeper had always been more flexible with the rules when it came to Emily. Whatever you have to say, you can say it right here. Richard crossed his arms. Very well, Margaret took a deep breath. Mr. Richard, ever since the little one came to live here, I've seen her sad every day. She follows all the rules, studies, doesn't cause trouble. But she's a child who lost her parents and is trying to adjust to a new life. Margaret, Richard tried to interrupt. Let me finish, please, the housekeeper continued firmly. These 3 days I was away caring for my mother. Something happened. When I arrived just now for the first time in months, I saw Emily truly smile. Richard looked at his granddaughter, who was petting Duke, and did indeed seem brighter than he'd seen her since she arrived. And look how well she cared for this dog, Margaret pointed at Duke. It shows responsibility, compassion, love, qualities you always wanted your Daniel to have. The mention of his deceased son made Richard clench his jaw. Daniel is dead, Margaret, and feeding fantasies won't bring him back. I know he's gone, Mr. Richard, Margaret said gently, but Emily is alive, and she needs to learn to love and be loved. Otherwise, she'll grow up with a closed heart, just like... Margaret stopped abruptly, realizing she'd gone too far. Just like who, Margaret? Richard asked, dangerously quiet. Like no one, sir. I spoke out of turn, the housekeeper backtracked. No, you were going to say, just like me, weren't you? Richard stepped closer. You think I have a closed heart? Margaret swallowed hard. In 15 years of service, she'd always respected boundaries, but now she felt the truth needed speaking. Mr. Richard, you've always been a good man. But since the accident, you've shut yourself off so much that sometimes I'm afraid Emily will grow up thinking showing love is wrong. And showing love is right? Richard laughed bitterly. Margaret, I loved my son more than anything in this world. And where did that get me? To a pain I wouldn't wish on my worst enemy. But don't you think it was worth it? Margaret asked bravely. All those years loving Daniel, watching him grow up, graduate, get married, even knowing it would end, wasn't it worth it? Richard fell silent. It was a question he asked himself every night, but had never spoken aloud. Grandpa, Emily approached timidly, I know you still love Dad, and I know it hurts so much when we lose someone we love. Richard looked at his granddaughter, surprised by the maturity in her words. But you know what hurts even more, Emily continued. It's when we're too afraid to love again, because then we're alive, but we're not really living. The 10-year-old's words cut through Richard's heart, like a sharp blade. How could she understand something he at 62 still hadn't accepted? Emily, you're just a child. You don't understand. I do understand, Emily interrupted. I lost Dad and Mom too, and I was also afraid to love someone again. But when I saw Duke hurt on the street, I realized something. Richard waited, barely breathing. If I don't take care of someone who needs me because I'm afraid of losing them, then I've already lost everything. Because then I'll live as if I'm already dead. The silence that followed was deafening. Richard felt as if all his defenses had been torn down by a 10-year-old and a wet mutt. Margaret seized the moment to approach Duke. The dog sniffed her hand and allowed her to pet him. He seems like a gentle, well-cared-for dog, the housekeeper observed. He doesn't look like an ordinary stray. Someone taught him to be obedient. That's true, Richard agreed automatically, still processing Emily's words. He follows commands and isn't aggressive. Maybe he got lost from his owners, Margaret suggested. Or maybe someone abandoned him. If he got lost, his owners must be looking for him, Richard thought aloud. And if he was abandoned, well, then he really has nowhere to go. Emily watched her grandfather closely, trying to read his thoughts. She knew Richard well enough to tell he was considering the possibility, even if reluctantly. Grandpa, she said softly, if we look for Duke's owners and don't find anyone, can he stay? Richard looked at his granddaughter, then at the dog, then at Margaret. 3 pairs of eyes were fixed on him, waiting for an answer that would change the course of their lives. Richard began, but was interrupted by his phone ringing. It was his personal assistant, probably with some office emergency. He answered automatically. Hello? Mr. Richard, sorry to bother you at home, but we have a situation, Brian, his assistant, said anxiously over the phone. What happened? Richard asked, grateful for the distraction. The Boston Mall is having electrical issues. The management is panicking because they might have to close the stores early. Can you come? Richard looked at Emily, who was still holding Duke, both of them wet and waiting for his decision. For a moment, he considered going to handle the mall crisis like he always did. Business emergencies were easier than emotional ones. Brian, call the emergency technicians. Handle it without me, Richard said, surprising himself. Sir, but you always... Not today, Brian. I trust you to handle it. He hung up without further explanation. Margaret and Emily exchanged glances, stunned. It was the first time Richard had refused to go solve a problem at work. Grandpa, aren't you going to work? Emily asked timidly. Not today. Richard put his phone in his pocket. Today I'm staying here to sort out this situation with Duke. The dog's name slipped naturally from his lips, as if he had always been part of the family. Dear listener, if you're enjoying the story, don't forget to like and especially subscribe to the channel. It helps us a lot as we're just starting out. Now back to it. First, let's get him dried off, Richard decided. Margaret, do you have any old towels? Yes, Mr. Richard. Margaret hurried to fetch the towels, relieved by the shift in tone. And Emily, Richard turned to his granddaughter, you're going to tell me exactly what happened these past 3 days. I want to know how you took care of him, what he ate, how you treated his injuries. Emily nodded eagerly, happy to see her grandfather genuinely interested in understanding the situation. Margaret returned with several soft towels. Together, they dried Duke, who remained cooperative throughout. Richard noticed the dog was indeed well cared for, with clean wounds already healing. Emily, where did you get the medicine to treat his injuries? Richard asked while examining one of the dog's paws. I asked the school pharmacist, Mrs. Susan. She explained how to clean them and said hydrogen peroxide and healing ointment work for dogs too, Emily replied. And you bought that with your lunch money? Yeah, Emily admitted sheepishly, but it wasn't expensive. And I wasn't very hungry anyway. Richard felt a pang in his chest. His granddaughter had given up her own needs to care for an injured animal, the same selfless kindness Michael had always shown. Margaret, make Emily a hearty lunch, Richard ordered. She needs to make up for the meals she missed. I was already thinking that, Mr. Richard, Margaret smiled. I'll make her favorite chicken sandwich. What about Duke? Emily asked hopefully. Richard hesitated. Feeding the dog would mean accepting he'd stay, at least temporarily. Margaret, do you know what kind of food is suitable for a dog this size? He asked, surprising both of them. My sister has a mutt like him, Margaret answered. She gives him premium kibble and sometimes plain boiled chicken. Then we'll arrange that, Richard decided. But it's temporary, he added quickly, more to convince himself than anyone else. Emily smiled for the first time since her grandfather had come home. A genuine smile that lit up her face and reminded Richard of how Michael used to smile as a child. Thank you, Grandpa, Emily said shyly, stepping closer. Richard bent down and hugged his granddaughter for the first time in months. He felt how small and fragile she was in his arms, and how selfish he'd been to shut her out. I'm sorry I yelled, Emily, he murmured in her ear. You scared me, but you did the right thing saving Duke. Emily pulled back and looked at her grandfather in surprise. You really think so? I do, Richard confirmed. You showed courage, compassion, and responsibility. Those are important qualities. Duke moved closer and sat beside Emily, as if sensing something significant was happening. But now we need to be practical, Richard continued. First, we'll take Duke to the vet for a full checkup. We need to make sure he's healthy. What if he's sick? Emily asked worriedly. Then we'll treat him, Richard replied without hesitation, surprising even himself at how easily the words came. And after the vet? Emily wanted to know. Emily. Then we'll look for his possible owners. We'll put up ads, search online, ask around the neighborhood. If someone is looking for him, it's our duty to return him. Emily nodded, understanding the logic, but clearly hoping no one would come forward to claim Duke. And if no one shows up, she asked, her voice full of hope. Richard looked at his granddaughter, then at the dog watching them intently, then at Margaret, who was smiling discreetly in the corner of the kitchen. If no one comes forward in, let's say, 2 weeks, then we'll talk about the possibility of him staying. Really? Emily asked, her eyes shining. Really, Richard confirmed, but with conditions. You'll have to take full responsibility for him, feeding him, bathing him, cleaning up when he makes a mess, and your schoolwork still comes first. I promise, Grandpa. Emily jumped with joy. I'll take really good care of him. And no letting him sleep in your bed, Richard added. He'll have his own place to sleep. Okay, Emily agreed quickly, willing to accept any condition. Richard looked around the wet kitchen and sighed. Margaret, could you call a cleaning service to— No need, Mr. Richard, Margaret interrupted. Emily and I will clean everything up, right, sweetheart? Yes, Emily agreed eagerly. I promise I'll make everything spotless. Richard watched the interaction between the housekeeper and his granddaughter, noticing how Margaret had always protected Emily and treated her like the daughter she never had. All right, Richard agreed, but I'll help too. You? Margaret was surprised. Richard had never involved himself in household chores. "Yes." Richard took off his jacket and rolled up his sleeves. "If we're doing this, we're doing it together." For the next 30 minutes, the three of them worked side by side to clean the kitchen. Richard was surprised to find something relaxing about doing a simple manual task after years of dealing only with complex business problems. Duke sat in a corner, watching everything attentively, as if he wanted to help, but didn't know how. "He's very well behaved," Richard remarked, wiping the floor with a cloth. "I told you," Emily said proudly. "He's super smart and polite." "I still think he might have an owner," Richard mused. "A dog this well trained doesn't just appear on the street out of nowhere." "Maybe his owners mistreated him," Margaret suggested. "Sometimes people get tired of their pets and abandon them." "If that's the case, then they don't deserve him back," Richard said, with a firmness that surprised even himself. Emily stopped cleaning and looked at her grandfather with admiration. "You'd really let him stay if you found out his owners abandoned him?" Richard thought for a moment before answering. "Emily, abandonment is a form of cruelty. If someone was cruel to Duke, then yes, he deserves a home where he'll be loved and cared for." "Like here," Emily smiled. "Like here," Richard confirmed, realizing he'd just emotionally committed to the animal. When they finished cleaning, the kitchen was spotless again. Margaret made sandwiches for everyone, including small pieces of plain chicken for Duke. "Now I'll call the vet," Richard announced. "I want Duke examined today." "Today's Saturday, Mr. Richard," Margaret reminded him. "Most vets aren't open." "Then I'll find one that handles emergencies," Richard said, determined. "Money isn't an issue." While Richard made the calls, Emily sat on the floor next to Duke, who was delicately eating the pieces of chicken. "Margaret," Emily whispered, "do you think Grandpa will really let Duke stay?" Margaret approached and sat beside the girl. "You know, sweetheart, I've worked for your grandfather for 15 years, and today I saw something I hadn't seen in a long time." "What?" Emily asked curiously. "I saw him happy," Margaret smiled. Even while arguing and complaining, I could see in his eyes that he was happy. It had been so long since that happened. "Since Dad died?" Emily asked innocently. "Since Dad died," Margaret confirmed sadly. "Your grandfather closed himself off so much to avoid pain that he forgot how good it feels to experience joy." "And do you think Duke can help him remember?" "I think you're already helping him remember," Margaret stroked the girl's hair. "Duke will just make it easier." Richard approached, putting away his phone. "I managed to schedule a vet in about an hour," he announced. "He'll come to the house as an emergency visit." "At home?" Emily perked up. "I thought it would be better for the first exam. Duke will be more comfortable in a familiar environment," Richard explained. "Grandpa, can I ask you something?" Emily stood and walked over to him. "Of course." "Why did you change your mind about Duke?" Richard fell silent for a few seconds, searching for an honest answer. Because you reminded me of something I had forgotten," he finally said. "What?" "That sometimes it's worth the risk of loving," Richard confessed, feeling a lump in his throat. Emily smiled and hugged her grandfather again. This time, Richard returned the embrace without hesitation, realizing how foolish he had been to deny himself that genuine affection. Duke moved closer to them and nuzzled Richard's leg, as if wanting to join the moment. Richard looked down, and without thinking too much, patted the dog's head. "Welcome to the family, Duke," he murmured softly, but loud enough for Emily and Margaret to hear. The two exchanged a knowing glance, understanding that this moment marked the beginning of a new chapter in their lives. An hour later, Dr. Robert Thompson, an experienced veterinarian in his 50s, arrived at the mansion with a case full of equipment. Richard greeted him personally, something he rarely did with service providers. "Dr. Thompson, thank you for coming on such short notice on a Saturday," Richard said. "Of course, Mr. Miller. Over the phone, I understood you found an injured dog." "My granddaughter found him," Richard corrected, a touch of pride in his voice. "She brought him home and cared for him for 3 days." "I see, and where is the animal?" Richard led the vet to the living room, where Emily waited with Duke in her lap. The dog was visibly nervous at the sight of a stranger. "Hello, dear," Dr. Thompson greeted Emily kindly. "You must be the heroine who saved this beautiful dog." Emily blushed at the compliment. His name is Duke, she said. Duke, what a lovely name, the veterinarian said, moving closer slowly. May I examine him? Emily glanced at Richard, who nodded encouragingly. You can, she agreed. He's very well behaved. Dr. Thompson began the exam, carefully checking Duke while chatting with Emily about how she had found him. Given the injuries and his overall condition, I'd say he was mistreated, the vet observed seriously. But you did an excellent job caring for him. The cuts are healing well. Emily handled everything herself, Richard remarked proudly. Impressive for a girl her age. Dr. Thompson smiled at Emily. You have a way with animals. Can I be a vet when I grow up? Emily asked spontaneously. Of course you can, the vet replied. If you enjoy studying and caring for animals, you could be a wonderful veterinarian. Richard felt a strange emotion hearing his granddaughter talk about the future with such enthusiasm. For months, she had seemed to just go through the motions without dreams or expectations. Well, let's do a full checkup, Dr. Robert announced. I need to see if he has a microchip, if his vaccines are up to date, and run some tests. Over the next 40 minutes, the vet examined Duke thoroughly. The dog was cooperative, allowing all procedures without resistance. I have good news and bad news, Dr. Robert finally announced. Richard's stomach tightened. Start with the bad, he requested. He doesn't have an ID chip, so it'll be harder to find his original owners. And based on his physical traits and behavior, I'd say he's a golden retriever mixed with another breed, probably a Labrador, a dog of considerable value. And the good news? Emily asked eagerly. He's healthy, well-nourished, and clearly well-trained and socialized. No contagious diseases or serious health issues. He's a young dog, about 2 years old, in his prime. The vet smiled. Richard felt both relieved and worried. If Duke was a valuable dog, surely someone must be looking for him. Doctor, Robert, in your professional opinion, was this dog abandoned or lost? Richard asked. The vet thought carefully before answering. Based on his injuries and where he was found, I'd say abandoned. A lost dog is usually found near the owner's home. This one was found far from any upscale residential area where this type of dog typically lives. So someone threw him away like trash, Richard said angrily. Unfortunately, it happens more often than we'd like, Dr. Robert confirmed sadly. People buy purebred dogs on impulse and then grow tired of the responsibility. Emily hugged Duke tighter. But now he has a real family, she declared firmly. Dr. Robert smiled at the girl's determination. Can I make a suggestion? The vet addressed Richard. Of course. Post some ads looking for the original owners. If no one comes forward with proof of ownership in 15 days, you can assume he was abandoned and officially adopt him. Is that legal? Richard asked. Perfectly legal. 15 days is the standard time frame for these situations. After that, you can register him as yours legally. Richard looked at Emily, who watched him expectantly. Then that's what we'll do, he decided. 15 days to search for the original owners. If no one shows up, Duke stays with us officially. What if someone does? Emily asked quietly. If someone comes forward with proof they're the rightful owner and didn't mistreat him, then we'll have to return him, Richard explained gently. But if we find out they abused or abandoned him, then they've lost any right to him. Emily nodded, understanding the fairness of the decision. Dr. Robert, could you give us some guidance on basic care? Richard asked. We've never had a dog before. With pleasure, the vet brightened. First, let's talk about food. For the next hour, Dr. Robert gave them a full lesson on canine care. Richard took notes in a notebook, taking the responsibility seriously. One last question, Doctor, Richard said as the vet prepared to leave. What kind of exercise does Duke need? Golden retrievers are active dogs. He'll need at least one long walk a day, plus playtime and mental stimulation. They're very smart and get bored easily. Richard thought about his own sedentary routine and realized having Duke would mean changes to his lifestyle. I can walk him every day, Emily offered. A 10-year-old can't walk a dog this size alone, Dr. Robert Thompson warned. He's strong and could pull. He needs an adult with him. Richard looked at his granddaughter and made a decision that surprised even himself. Then we'll walk him together, he announced. It'll be good for me to get some exercise too. Margaret nearly dropped the tray she was carrying. In 15 years, she had never seen Richard exercise beyond the rare times he used the treadmill in the mansion's private gym. After the vet left, leaving behind a prescription for vitamins and detailed care instructions, Richard sat down with Emily in the living room. "Emily, I want you to understand something important," he began seriously. "What, Grandpa?" "Having a pet is a big responsibility. Duke will depend on us for everything: food, water, exercise, affection, medical care. It's like taking care of a child who never grows up." Emily nodded solemnly. "Are you ready for that responsibility?" Richard asked. "Even when you don't feel like it? Even when it's hard? Even when he gets old and sick?" "I am," Emily answered without hesitation. "I promise I'll always take care of him." "And if someday you can't? If you get sick or need to travel? Then you'll take care of him for me," Emily said simply. Richard felt something stir in his chest. His granddaughter's absolute trust in his kindness touched him deeply. "Yes," he agreed. "Then I'll take care of him for you." Duke, as if understanding the conversation, walked over to Richard and rested his head on his knee. Richard hesitated for a moment, then began stroking the dog's soft fur. "You know, Emily, I had a dog when I was a boy," Richard confessed. "You did?" Emily perked up. "What was he like?" "He was a black and white mutt I found on the street, just like you found Duke. I must have been about 8. What happened to him?" Richard was silent for a moment, remembering. "My father wouldn't let me keep him, said we didn't have the money to feed a dog, so he took Shadow away." "Away where?" "I never knew," Richard admitted sadly. "My father said he took him to a farm where he'd be happy, but I always suspected that he was lying." Emily moved closer to her grandfather and took his hand. "I'm sorry, Grandpa. I promised myself that when I grew up and had my own home, I'd have as many dogs as I wanted," Richard continued. "But then life happened. Work, business, marriage, Daniel, and I forgot about that dream." "But now you have your own home," Emily pointed out, "and Duke needs you." Richard looked at the dog still resting its head on his knee, then at his granddaughter, watching him hopefully. "Yes," he smiled, "now I have my own home, and I can finally keep that promise I made to myself when I was 8. "So, Duke can stay?" Emily asked, her eyes shining. "Duke can stay," Richard confirmed. "But first, we'll do our duty and look for his original owners. 2 weeks, like the doctor suggested." "What if no one comes forward?" "If no one does, then we'll throw Duke an official welcome party," Richard promised. Emily threw her arms around her grandfather's neck, hugging him so tightly he nearly lost his balance. "Thank you, Grandpa. You're the best grandpa in the world." Richard returned the hug, feeling a happiness he hadn't known in years. He glanced around the living room, which had always felt empty and cold to him, but now seemed warmer with Duke asleep on the rug and Emily smiling in his arms. "Margaret?" he called to the housekeeper watching from the doorway. "Yes, Mr. Richard?" "On Monday, I want you to buy everything Duke will need: a bed, toys, high-quality food, a collar, a leash, only the best." "I'll add it to the list right away," Margaret smiled. "And Emily," Richard turned to his granddaughter, "tomorrow we'll post ads looking for Duke's owners. We'll put them online in newspapers, at pet stores. We want to make sure we're doing the right thing." "Okay," Emily agreed, though she was clearly hoping no one would come forward. "Now," Richard stood up, "let's set up a temporary space for Duke to sleep tonight. Tomorrow we'll get him a proper bed." "Can he sleep in my room?" Emily asked hopefully. "He can," Richard surprised himself by agreeing. "But just for tonight. Tomorrow he'll have his own space." Emily quietly cheered, happy with the temporary arrangement. As they prepared a comfortable spot for Duke in Emily's room, Richard reflected on how a simple dog had changed the entire dynamic of his home in just a few hours. For the first time in months, he wasn't thinking about work, dwelling on past losses or obsessively worrying about the future. He was simply living in the present, caring for his granddaughter and an animal that had unexpectedly entered their lives. "Grandpa," Emily called as she laid out a blanket on the floor for Duke. "Yes?" Do you think Dad and Mum would be happy knowing we saved Duke? Richard felt a lump in his throat, but this time it wasn't just pain. It was a mix of longing and gratitude. I'm sure they would, he answered honestly. Your father was always generous to those in need, and your mother loved animals. So they'd be proud of us? Very proud, Richard confirmed, kneeling beside his granddaughter. And you know what? I'm very proud of you too. Really? Really? You showed courage, compassion, and responsibility. Those are qualities your father would have loved to see in you. Emily smiled, and Richard realized it was the first time he could talk about Daniel without feeling only pain. There was sadness, yes, but also pride and love. Duke settled onto the blanket, circling once before lying down. He looked at Richard and Emily as if thanking them for everything. "Good night, Duke," Emily whispered, petting the dog. "Good night, boy," Richard added, surprising himself with how natural it felt. When they left Emily's room, Richard felt something strange. The house no longer seemed empty or silent. There was life pulsing within those walls. "Margaret," he called to the housekeeper, who was finishing up in the kitchen. "Yes, Mr. Richard." "Thank you," he said simply. "For what, sir?" "For always taking such good care of Emily, and for helping me see that sometimes rules need to bend." Margaret smiled, tears in her eyes. "I just want to see the two of you happy, Mr. Richard. That's all I've ever wanted." Well, Richard looked around the house, which now felt like a real home. "I think we're on the right path." That night, Richard slept better than he had in months. For the first time since the accident, he didn't have nightmares about loss and abandonment. He dreamed of walks in the park, of Emily playing with Duke, of laughter echoing through the house. When he woke up on Sunday morning, he was greeted by a sound he hadn't heard in a long time, laughter coming from the backyard. Richard dressed quickly and went downstairs to investigate. He found Emily playing fetch with Duke in the garden, while Margaret prepared breakfast with a smile on her face. "Good morning, Grandpa," Emily waved when she saw him at the window. "Good morning, sweetheart," Richard replied, feeling like it truly was a good morning. Duke ran to the window and barked once as if greeting Richard. It was a happy bark, not aggressive. "Good morning to you too, Duke," Richard replied, smiling at his own silliness for talking to a dog. When he joined them in the garden for breakfast, Richard noticed something different in his movements. He wasn't in a hurry. He wasn't constantly checking his phone. He was simply present, enjoying his granddaughter's company and watching Duke's antics. "Grandpa, can we make the posters for Duke today?" Emily asked between bites of her croissant. "We can," Richard confirmed. "We'll take nice pictures of him and create very detailed posters." "What if someone calls saying they're the owner?" "Then we'll investigate very carefully before handing Duke over to anyone," Richard assured her. "We won't let anyone fool us." Emily seemed more at ease with her grandfather's promise. They spent the morning taking pictures of Duke in various poses, creating detailed posters to be posted on lost pet websites, local newspapers, and social media. Found. Golden male dog, approximately 2 years old, very well cared for and trained. Richard read the poster they had created. Found in the Chelsea neighborhood. Contact for more information and proof of ownership. "Do you think anyone will call?" Emily asked, clearly hoping for a negative answer. "I don't know," Richard replied honestly, "but if someone does, we'll evaluate the situation very carefully before making any decisions." "How?" "We'll ask for pictures of the dog as a puppy, purchase or adoption records, vet records. A real owner would have those things." Emily nodded, satisfied with her grandfather's thoroughness. In the afternoon, while Duke napped in the garden after an intense play session, Richard found himself watching the scene from his office window. Emily was reading a book under the shade of a tree, one hand automatically stroking the fur of the sleeping dog beside her. It was a scene of domestic peace he had never imagined possible in his home. For years, that space had just been a place to live, not a home. Now, for the first time, he felt like he truly had a family. The phone rang, interrupting his thoughts. It was Brian, his assistant. "Mr. Richard, sorry to bother you on a Sunday, but we've resolved the issue with the Boston Mall. The technicians worked all night and everything's running normally now." "That's great, Brian. Thank you for handling it." Sir, don't you want to know the details? Brian asked, surprised. Not necessary. I trust your work, Richard replied, realizing he really wasn't worried about the problem's specifics. Okay. And on Monday we have the meeting with the investors for the new Miami Mall. Richard looked out the window again, watching Emily teach Duke to shake. Brian, move that meeting to Tuesday morning. Sir, but Monday I have personal commitments, Richard explained, surprising both his assistant and himself. Personal commitments, sir? Yes. I'm taking my granddaughter and our dog for a walk in the park. The silence on the other end of the line was telling. Brian, you there? I am, sir. It's just, you've never had personal commitments before. Richard laughed, realizing how predictable and limited his life had become. Well, Brian, it seems things are changing around here. After hanging up, Richard went down to the garden and joined Emily and Duke. How about the three of us go to Central Park tomorrow? He suggested. Really? Emily perked up. You're not going to work? No. Monday will be our day to get to know Duke better and for him to discover the outside world. Emily jumped for joy, waking Duke, who immediately joined in the celebration, barking and running in circles. Richard watched the pure happiness of his granddaughter and the dog, feeling something he hadn't experienced in years, positive anticipation for the future. By Sunday evening, the three of them were sitting on the back porch, watching the sunset. Duke lay between Richard and Emily as if he had always been part of the family. Grandpa? Emily broke the contemplative silence. Yes? Thank you for letting Duke stay. Thank you, Richard replied. For showing me it's worth taking risks when it comes to love. Emily snuggled into her grandfather's arm, and Duke rested his head on Richard's knee. Richard felt a fullness he hadn't known since before the accident. You know, Emily, I don't think Duke came here by accident. No? No, I think he arrived exactly when we needed him most. To teach me how to love again? Emily asked with wisdom beyond her years. To teach us how to love again, Richard corrected. All of us. Me, you, even Margaret has been happier since he arrived. That's true, Emily agreed. The whole house feels different. It's more alive, Richard observed. It's more ours, Emily added. Richard looked around the garden, which he had always seen merely as part of the property, but now he saw it as the backyard where his granddaughter played with their dog. The change wasn't just in the house, it was in how he saw it. Emily, can I ask you something? Of course. Were you happy before Duke came? Emily thought carefully before answering. I wasn't exactly sad, but I wasn't happy either. It was like I was just existing. Richard felt a tightness in his chest. That was exactly how he had felt too. And now? Now I feel like I'm really living. Emily smiled. I have someone to take care of, someone who needs me. And you. You're different too. Different how? More here. Before you were always around, but it was like you weren't really here, you know? Richard knew exactly what she meant. He had been physically present but emotionally absent for months. You're right, he admitted. I wasn't really here. I was just getting through the days. And now? Richard looked at Duke, sleeping peacefully between them, then at Emily, who watched him with genuine interest. Now I want to be here. I want to live each day, not just pass through them. Because of Duke? Because of both of you. Richard included his granddaughter. Duke helped me remember what I'd forgotten about you. What? That you're not just a responsibility I took on. You're my granddaughter, my family, and I love you. Emily smiled with tears in her eyes. I love you too, Grandpa. I always have, even when you were distant. Richard hugged his granddaughter, realizing how foolish he'd been to deny himself that love for so long. I'm sorry for being such a distant grandfather, Emily. I was so afraid of getting hurt again that I missed the chance to be happy. But you're not afraid anymore. Richard considered the question. The fear was still there, fear of losing Emily, fear of something happening to Duke, fear that happiness might be temporary. But now there was something stronger than fear. I'm still afraid, he confessed. But now I have something stronger than fear. What? Hope. When night fell and they went inside, Richard noticed how the sounds of the house had changed. No longer just the heavy silence of an empty home, there was now the soft click of Duke's nails on the hardwood floor, Emily's occasional laughter, and Margaret's affectionate murmurs as she spoke to the dog. Before going to bed, Richard stopped by Emily's room to say goodnight. He found her reading a book in bed with Buddy lying on a blanket on the floor beside her. "Good night, sweetheart. Good night, Grandpa. Thank you for the best weekend of my life." Richard felt a tightness in his chest, realizing how rarely he had provided happy moments for his granddaughter. "From now on, we'll have many more weekends like this," he promised. "With Buddy." "With Buddy," he confirmed. "But what if someone shows up saying he's theirs?" Richard moved closer to the bed and sat on the edge. "Emily, can I tell you a secret?" She nodded eagerly. "I'm hoping just as much as you that no one comes forward." "Really?" "Really, Buddy is already part of our family. It would be so hard to let him go now." Emily smiled with relief. "So we can dream he'll stay forever?" "We can dream," Richard agreed, "and we'll hope those dreams come true. Good night, Grandpa. Good night, Emily. Good night, Buddy." The dog lifted his head and wagged his tail once, as if responding to the greeting. Richard went to his room with a sense of fulfillment he hadn't felt in a long time. For the first time in months, he was looking forward to the next day, instead of just resigned to facing it. On Monday morning, Richard woke to the sound of cheerful barking coming from the yard. Instead of being annoyed by the noise, he smiled. It was the sound of life happening in his home. When he went downstairs for breakfast, he found Emily already dressed and ready, with Buddy sitting patiently by her side. "Ready for our walk in the park?" Richard asked. "Absolutely," Emily replied excitedly. "And Buddy can't wait either." Richard looked at the dog, who did indeed seem expectant, as if he understood something special was about to happen. "Margaret, would you like to join us?" Richard offered, surprising the housekeeper. "Me, Mr. Richard? Of course. Buddy is part of the family now, and so are you. It would be nice if we all went together." Margaret smiled, touched by the invitation. "It would be my pleasure, Mr. Richard." An hour later, the four of them were in Central Park. Richard pushed a borrowed wheelchair for Margaret, who was recovering from a knee injury. Emily held Buddy's leash as he explored everything with controlled curiosity. "He's never seen so many people in one place," Emily observed, watching how Buddy paid attention to every passerby. "But he's behaving so well," Richard noted. "He's not pulling or barking at other dogs." "He's very well-mannered," Margaret commented. "Whoever trained him did an excellent job." The housekeeper's remark reminded Richard that they were still searching for Buddy's possible original owners. The thought brought a twinge of anxiety. "Dad always said walks in the park are good for the soul," Emily remarked, as she watched Buddy sniff a tree with interest. "Your father was right," Richard agreed. "I'd forgotten how nice it is to be outdoors without work obligations." "You've always worked so much," Margaret observed. "Even when Michael was little." Richard felt a pang of regret. He'd missed so many moments with his son because of work, and now he risked repeating the same mistake with Emily. "Margaret, from now on, I want to change my routine. Less work, more family time." "Are you sure, sir?" the housekeeper asked, surprised. "I am. I don't want to make the same mistakes as before." They found a nice spot by the lake and sat on the grass. Buddy lay beside Emily, watching the ducks in the water with interest. "Look, Grandpa, he's watching the ducks." Emily laughed as Buddy tilted his head, intrigued by the waterfowl. Richard observed the interaction between his granddaughter and the dog, noticing how Duke was naturally protective of Emily. When other people approached, he would subtly position himself between them and the girl. "He's protecting you," Richard remarked. "Really?" Emily perked up. "How can you tell?" "Watch his posture. Always between you and any stranger who comes near." Emily paid attention and truly noticed the behavior. "Is that good or bad?" "It's very good," Richard smiled. "It shows he already considers you family." "And you too, Grandpa," Emily pointed out. "Look how he keeps an eye on you." Richard observed and realized Duke was indeed dividing his attention between him and Emily, as if responsible for watching over both. "That's true," he murmured, touched by the animal's devotion. They spent over 2 hours in the park, walking, watching other dogs play, and simply enjoying each other's company. Richard didn't check his phone once. When they returned home, everyone was tired but happy. Duke had behaved perfectly the entire time, confirming he was indeed a well-socialized and trained dog. "Margaret, any calls about Duke's ads?" Richard asked, checking the answering machine. "No, Mr. Richard. No calls." Richard felt a relief he tried to hide, but Emily noticed. "You're happy no one called," she observed. "A little," Richard admitted. "Each day that passes, it gets harder to imagine our lives without Duke." "For me too," Emily agreed, hugging the dog. Over the rest of the week, the household routine changed completely. Richard began working fewer hours, coming home in time for dinner with Emily and walks with Duke. Meals, once quiet and rushed, now became moments of conversation and laughter. Duke settled into the family with an ease that surprised everyone. He seemed to instinctively understand the house rules and quickly adapted to the routine. In the morning, he woke with Emily and followed her to the kitchen for breakfast. During the day, he stayed with Margaret, who discovered she had a soft spot for animals. In the afternoon, he eagerly awaited Emily's return from school, and in the evening, he joined the family's relaxation time. "It's like he's always lived here," Margaret remarked on Thursday, watching Duke sleep peacefully in his new bed, which Richard had ordered. "It's true," Richard agreed. "He's adjusted perfectly to our routine. Or maybe we've adjusted to his," Emily wisely suggested. Richard considered his granddaughter's observation. Truly, they had all shifted their routines to accommodate Duke's needs. And surprisingly, those changes had improved everyone's quality of life. On Friday, exactly 1 week since Duke had arrived, Richard received the first call about the ads. "Hello?" he answered, his stomach tightening. "Hi, I saw the ad about the golden dog you found," a woman's voice said on the other end. Richard signaled to Emily, who was playing with Duke in the living room. "Yes, we did find him. Could you give me more details about your dog?" "Well, he ran away about 2 weeks ago. He's a male golden retriever, quite large. Can you tell me his approximate age?" Around 5 years, I think." Richard frowned. Duke was clearly not 5. Dr. Robert had been adamant that he was about 2. "And do you have photos of him?" "Vet records?" "I have photos on my phone. Well, we didn't take him to the vet much." Another red flag for Richard. A 5-year-old golden retriever should have an extensive vet history. "Could you send me the photos on WhatsApp?" Richard asked, giving his number. "Of course, I'll send them now." A few minutes later, Richard received the photos. It was indeed a golden retriever, but visibly older than Duke, with darker fur and different physical features. "Emily, come take a look," Richard called his granddaughter. Emily approached with Buddy following her. "Is it Duke?" she asked eagerly. "No." Richard showed her the photos. "It's a golden retriever, but it's not Duke. This one is older and has different physical traits." Emily sighed in relief. Richard called the woman back and gently explained that it wasn't the same dog. She sounded disappointed, but thanked him for his time. "One less," Richard murmured after hanging up. "How many more do you think we'll call?" Emily asked. "I don't know, but with every call that doesn't pan out, I'm more convinced Duke was truly abandoned." Over the weekend, 3 more calls came in. 2 were clearly attempts by people who just wanted a free purebred dog without proof of ownership. The third was from a man who described a similar dog, but when Richard asked for specific details, it was clear it wasn't Duke. "People think we're fools," Richard remarked after the third false lead. "They want an expensive dog without proving it was ever theirs." "That's bad for people who actually lost a dog," Emily pointed out. "True. That's why it's important to be careful." By Sunday evening, Richard realized a full week had passed since Duke's arrival, and they hadn't received a single convincing call. He began to allow himself to believe that maybe, just maybe, no one was looking for Duke. "Emily," he called to his granddaughter, who was brushing Duke in the garden. "Yes, Grandpa." If we still don't get any convincing calls in another week, we can officially consider Duke ours. Really? Emily perked up. Really? 2 weeks is more than enough time for someone to search for a lost pet. What if someone shows up after the 2 weeks? Richard considered the question. Legally, after 2 weeks and with the ads published, they'd be safe to officially adopt Duke. After 2 weeks, if someone claims to be Duke's owner, they'd have to prove they didn't abandon him. And even then, we could challenge it legally since we provided all necessary care and posted the proper notices. Emily seemed satisfied with the answer. So, 1 more week until Duke is officially ours. 1 more week, Richard confirmed, feeling an anticipation he hadn't experienced in a long time. That night, Richard had trouble sleeping, but not from anxiety or worry. It was positive excitement. For the first time in months, he was looking forward to the future, mentally planning what life with Duke as a permanent part of the family would be like. Monday morning, the routine continued as it had the previous week. Richard took Emily to school, worked a few hours, came home for lunch and to walk Duke, then returned to the office to finish the day's tasks. "Brian," he told his assistant during a meeting, "I want you to rearrange my schedule for the coming months." "How so, Mr. Miller?" "I only want to work half days on Mondays and Fridays, and no work on weekends unless it's a real emergency." Brian looked at him as if he'd spoken in a foreign language. "Mr. Miller, that will significantly impact the company's productivity." "Brian, I built this company over 40 years. It can function perfectly fine without me being present 80 hours a week. But sir, and besides," Richard interrupted, "I have a family to take care of now." "Emily, you mean?" "Emily and Duke," Richard said matter-of-factly. Brian's eyes widened. "Duke, sir?" "Our dog," Richard explained, as if it were the most natural thing in the world. His assistant fell silent for a few seconds, processing the information. "You adopted a dog?" "Actually, my granddaughter rescued an abandoned dog, and we're in the process of officially adopting him." "I see," Brian murmured, clearly not understanding at all. "Brian, I know this is a big change, but it's a necessary one. For years I lived only to work. Now I want to work to live." "Very well, Mr. Miller, I'll reorganize your schedule as requested." "Thank you. And Brian." "Yes, sir. If you ever have children or a family, don't make my mistake of always putting work first." "Family is more important." Brian nodded, clearly struck by his boss's shift in perspective. When Richard arrived home that afternoon, he paused in the doorway at the scene before him. Emily was doing homework on the coffee table, with Duke lying beside her, serving as a living pillow. Margaret sat reading in the armchair, occasionally glancing fondly at the pair. It was a picture of domestic tranquility Richard had never imagined possible in his home. "How was school today?" he asked, walking over to Emily. "Great," she replied excitedly. "I told my teacher about Duke, and she said taking care of an animal teaches responsibility and empathy." "Your teacher is right," Richard agreed, sitting beside his granddaughter on the couch. Duke lifted his head and greeted him with a wag of his tail, but stayed put next to Emily. "He won't leave my side when I'm studying," Emily remarked, stroking the dog. "It's like he knows I need to focus." "Dogs are very smart," Richard observed. "They sense our moods and needs." "Grandpa's different too," Emily said suddenly. "Different how?" "More relaxed. Before, you always seemed worried, even at home." Richard reflected on his granddaughter's words. It was true. Lately, he'd been able to leave work concerns behind when he walked through the door. "It's the Duke effect," he joked. "He brought us peace." "It's not just Duke," Emily said wisely. "It's family. Now we're a real family." Her words touched Richard deeply. There was a fundamental difference between living in the same house and being a family, and Duke had helped bridge that gap. On Tuesday, Richard received 2 more calls about Duke. One was clearly fake. The person couldn't answer basic questions about the dog's behavior. The second was more convincing, but when Richard asked for veterinary records, the caller stammered and eventually hung up. 2 more false leads, he reported to Emily at dinner. "Why do people do that?" she asked. "Because golden retrievers are expensive dogs. Some think they can take advantage of the situation to get a purebred for free." But don't they know Duke already has a family? Richard smiled at how Emily referred to them as Duke's family. No, they only see a chance to profit. That's so sad, Emily murmured. Duke deserves a family who truly loves him. And he has one, Richard said firmly. He has us. On Wednesday, something unexpected happened. Richard received a call that sounded genuine. "Hello, my name is Michael. I saw your notice about the golden retriever you found." The man's voice was emotional. "Yes, we found a dog. Can you tell me about yours?" "It's Buddy. He ran away 2 weeks ago while my wife was walking him in the park. She tripped and accidentally let go of the leash. We've been searching desperately for him." Richard's stomach tightened. The story sounded convincing. "Can you describe Buddy physically for me?" "Of course. He's 2 years old, light golden, with a small scar on his left ear from surgery he had as a puppy." Richard looked at Duke, who was sleeping near Emily. He hadn't noticed any scar on the ear, but it could have been overlooked. "And do you have veterinary records, photos?" "We have everything. I can bring them tomorrow for you to see. Please, could I see the dog you found?" Richard hesitated. It was the first truly convincing call they'd received. "Where do you live?" "Nearby in Chelsea. Buddy ran away in the exact area where you found the dog." "All right," Richard decided. "Tomorrow at 3 p.m. you can come here to see if it's the same dog, but bring all the documentation." "Of course. Thank you so much. We're desperate to find Buddy." After hanging up, Richard stayed silent for a few minutes. For the first time, he'd received a call that seemed genuinely legitimate. "Grandpa," Emily approached, noticing his worried expression. "A man is coming tomorrow to see if Duke is his dog." Emily paled. "What if he is?" "If he is, and they can prove they're the rightful owners and didn't mistreat Duke, then we'll have to give him back." Tears welled up in Emily's eyes. "But I don't want Duke to leave." Richard hugged his granddaughter, his own heart tightening at the possibility. "I don't either, sweetheart. But if he really has a family who loves him and is searching for him, it wouldn't be right to keep him here. What if they don't really love him? What if they were neglectful and that's why he ran away?" "That's why we'll investigate carefully before making any decision," Richard assured her. "We won't hand Duke over to just anyone." That night, Emily had nightmares and woke up several times. Duke, sensing her distress, stayed closer to her than usual. Richard also slept poorly, torn between the fear of losing Duke and the guilt of not wanting to return him, if he truly belonged to the searching family. Thursday morning, the whole house was tense. Margaret prepared a special breakfast, as if it were an early farewell. Emily could barely eat, and even Duke seemed to sense something was different. "Grandpa," Emily said as she got ready for school, "promise you won't let them take Duke unless you're absolutely sure he's theirs?" "I promise," Richard assured her. "I'll be very thorough." "And if he really is their dog?" Richard knelt in front of his granddaughter. "Emily, if Duke truly belongs to these people and they can prove they took good care of him and he ran away by accident, then the right thing to do is give him back. Even if it hurts a lot?" "Even if it hurts a lot," Richard confirmed, his voice thick, "because loving someone sometimes means letting them go when it's best for them." Emily nodded, trying to be brave, but tears streamed down her face. "But that doesn't mean we won't miss him," Richard continued. "And it doesn't mean we can't find another dog to love." "It wouldn't be the same," Emily sobbed. "No, it wouldn't," Richard agreed, "but it would be a new chance to love and be loved." After Emily left for school, Richard stayed home waiting for the possible owners of Duke. He'd cancelled all his afternoon meetings, saying he had a family emergency. At exactly 3 p.m., the doorbell rang. Richard took a deep breath and went to answer, Duke curiously following behind. At the door stood a couple in their 40s. The woman had clearly been crying recently, and the man held a folder of documents. "Mr. Richard?" the man asked. "I'm Michael, the one who called yesterday." "And I'm Jennifer, his wife." The woman introduced herself, her voice choked with emotion. Richard observed them carefully. They seemed genuinely distressed and concerned. "Please, come in," Richard invited. When they entered the living room, Duke watched them closely but showed no sign of recognition. No excitement, fear, or discomfort. Just neutral curiosity. Is it him? Richard asked, watching the couple's reactions. Jennifer studied Duke carefully, then shook her head. No, it's not Buddy, she said with disappointment. Buddy is a bit bigger, with darker fur, and the scar on his ear. And his behavior is different too, Michael added. Buddy would be much more excitable around strangers. This dog is calmer. Richard felt a wave of relief he tried to hide. Are you sure? Absolutely, Jennifer confirmed. This is a beautiful golden retriever, but he's not our Buddy. I'm so sorry, Richard said sincerely. I hope you find Buddy soon. Thank you, Michael said, putting away the documents he'd brought. If you hear of anyone else who found a golden retriever, we'll definitely reach out, Richard promised. After the couple left, Richard sat on the couch next to Duke, feeling as though he'd been on an emotional roller coaster. You're not Buddy, he murmured to the dog, stroking his head. You're Duke, our Duke. Duke rested his head on Richard's leg, as if understanding the relief in his voice. When Emily came home from school, she found Richard and Duke asleep together on the living room couch. Grandpa, she called softly. Richard startled awake. Emily, how was school? I could barely focus. So, did they take Duke? No, Richard smiled. He wasn't their dog. Emily squealed with joy and threw herself onto the couch, hugging Duke so tightly he let out a protesting whine. Sorry, Duke. She laughed through tears of relief. I was just so scared of losing you. Richard watched the scene, his own emotions swelling. He'd spent the whole day afraid of losing something that had become essential to his life in just 2 weeks. Margaret, he called to the housekeeper. We have to celebrate. What happened? Margaret appeared in the living room. Duke gets to stay with us, Emily announced excitedly. Oh, how wonderful. Margaret clapped her hands. I'll make a special dinner to celebrate. And tomorrow, Richard declared, we're making Duke's adoption official. We'll go to the courthouse and register him as ours. Really? Emily asked, eyes shining. Really? 2 weeks have passed. We've had several calls, but none convincing. Duke is officially ours now. Emily hugged her grandfather so tightly he nearly lost his balance. Thank you, Grandpa. Thank you for letting Duke stay. Thank you for being the best grandpa in the world. Richard returned the hug, feeling a pure happiness he hadn't known in years. He looked around the room, Margaret smiling in the doorway, Emily radiant in his arms, and Duke watching everything with those intelligent brown eyes. No, he murmured. Thank you for showing me what a real family is. That night, during the special dinner Margaret prepared, Richard made an unexpected toast. I'd like to raise a glass, he said, lifting his orange juice. To Duke, Emily asked, raising hers too. To Duke, yes, but not just him, Richard smiled. I want to toast to family, our family, to Duke, who arrived as a wounded stranger and became an essential part of our lives. To Emily, who taught me that courage is loving, even when you're afraid of loss. And to Margaret, who always knew a house only becomes a home when it's filled with love. And to Grandpa, Emily added, who opened his heart and discovered he still had so much love to give. Cheers! Margaret raised her glass, tears in her eyes. Cheers! Richard and Emily repeated in unison. Buddy, as if understanding the solemnity of the moment, let out a single bark, his own toast. Everyone laughed, and Richard realized that sound, laughter echoing through the dining room, was something his home hadn't known in a long time. After dinner, while Emily played with Buddy in the garden and Margaret tidied the kitchen, Richard allowed himself a moment of reflection. 3 weeks ago, his life had been an empty routine of work and obligations. He existed, but he didn't live. His house was silent, his relationship with Emily distant, and he had convinced himself it was safer not to grow attached to anything or anyone. Now, thanks to a wounded dog and the courage of a 10-year-old girl, everything had changed. His home was full of life, his bond with Emily close and affectionate, and he had rediscovered the joy of loving and being loved. Grandpa, Emily approached, interrupting his thoughts. Can I ask you something? Of course, sweetheart. Do you regret letting Buddy stay? Richard looked at the dog, who lay at his feet as if he had always belonged there. Never, he answered without hesitation. Buddy brought us back to life. And you're not afraid to love anymore? Richard considered the question carefully. I'm still afraid, yes. Afraid of losing you, afraid something might happen. But I've learned something important. What? That the fear of losing can't be greater than the joy of having. You and Buddy taught me that. Emily smiled and snuggled into her grandfather's arm. I learned something too, she said. What? That family isn't just about sharing the same blood. Family is who chooses to stay together, take care of each other, and love even when it's hard. Richard hugged his granddaughter, struck by the wisdom of her words. You're absolutely right. So Buddy is family even though he wasn't born here? Buddy is family even though he wasn't born here, Richard confirmed. And he always will be, no matter what. Forever? Forever. Buddy moved closer and rested his head on Richard's knee, as if wanting to be part of the moment. Richard stroked him gently. Forever, boy, he repeated to the dog. You're part of this family now. By Friday evening, Richard had finalized Buddy's adoption at the courthouse, legally registering him as the Miller family pet. Emily insisted on being present for the entire process, holding Buddy's leash like a responsible little adult. There, Richard showed the document to his granddaughter. Now it's official. Buddy Miller is officially ours. Buddy Miller, Emily repeated, liking the sound. He has a last name now. He does, and a family for life. Over the weekend, they celebrated the official adoption with a small but meaningful gathering. Richard invited a few neighbors who had become friends in recent days, people they'd met during walks with Buddy. It's amazing how a dog can change people's lives, remarked Mrs. Dorothy, an elderly neighbor who always stopped to chat during their walks. True, Richard agreed. Buddy didn't just change our lives, he saved them. Saved them how? Richard looked at Emily, who was playing with Buddy and other neighborhood children in the garden. He taught us how to be a family again. On Sunday night, after the guests had left and the house returned to silence, Richard sat with Emily and Buddy on the back porch, watching the stars. Grandpa, Emily broke the quiet. Yes? Thank you. For what, sweetheart? For giving Buddy a chance, and for giving love another chance. Richard felt his eyes grow damp. Thank you for having the courage to save him, and for being patient with me while I learned to open my heart again. Do you think Mom and Dad would be proud of us? Richard looked up at the stars, imagining Daniel and Catherine watching that moment. I'm absolutely certain they would be. Your father always said a life without love isn't worth living, and now we understand that. And now we have so much love, Emily smiled. We do, Richard agreed, glancing at Duke, who slept peacefully between them. We have so much love, and finally, we have the courage to show it. 3 months had passed since Duke's arrival, and the transformation in the Miller family was visible to anyone who had known them before. Richard had become a more balanced businessman, delegating responsibilities and prioritizing family time. Emily flourished, growing more confident and joyful. Margaret radiated happiness, caring for a house that had finally become a true home. Duke had settled in as the heart of the family, the bond that held them all together. His presence brought routine, responsibility, joy, and most of all, an unconditional love that healed wounds once thought impossible to mend. You know, Emily, Richard said one Saturday morning as they walked Duke in the park, sometimes I think about what would have happened if you hadn't been brave enough to bring Duke home that day. Why? Because I think the three of us would still be lost. You alone with your sadness, me alone with mine, and Duke alone on the street. But we found each other, Emily wisely observed, and now no one is alone anymore. Richard stopped walking and looked at his granddaughter, struck once again by her maturity. That's true, we saved each other. Duke, noticing they had stopped, came running back and sat between them, as he always did when he sensed something important was being discussed. And we'll keep saving each other every day, Emily added, stroking Duke's fur, because that's what families do. Richard hugged his granddaughter and petted Duke, feeling deep gratitude for this second chance at happiness life had given him. Forever, he murmured. Forever, Emily agreed. Duke barked once as if sealing that promise with his own voice. And so, a family once wounded by fate found healing in the most unlikely love, that of a golden dog who arrived wet and injured on a rainy afternoon, bringing with him the magic to turn an empty house into a home full of life, laughter, and hope. The end. Now, we'd love to hear what you thought of this touching story. Do you think Richard made the right choice by letting Duke stay? How would you react if you found an injured animal? Share your thoughts in the comments and don't forget to leave a like. If you enjoyed this story, subscribe to the channel so you won't miss other heartwarming tales.